You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. At this time last year, the war in Ukraine had already lasted longer than virtually anyone predicted. Ukraine's military was still holding on. It surprised a lot of analysts because it was using a fraction of Russian firepower. At the peak of fighting in early 2023, CNN reported Ukrainian troops were firing between 6,000 and 7,000 artillery rounds per day. Russian forces, meanwhile, were firing nearly 10 times that amount. Last September, we spoke with journalist Julian Barnes about President Vladimir Putin's growing desperation for new munitions. At the time, rumors were swirling that he'd struck a deal with North Korean leadership to replenish his own country's stockpiles. It was an early sign the Russian president would do anything necessary to keep the war going in Ukraine. Julian Barnes covers U.S. intelligence agencies and international security for the New York Times. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you for having me.
Reports about the recent meeting between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong Un focused a lot on weapons sales. What do you, as someone who watches this beat closely, what do you conclude about the state of play in Russia, which is, after all, a resource-rich country with one of the biggest militaries in the world, if it needs to buy weapons from one of the world's poorest and most desperate states?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a complicated story, but this is an important one, right? It is vital to the war in Ukraine and what's going on there. Now, as you alluded to, Russia has a huge arms industry. They make a lot of different weapons, but they're also firing enormous amounts of weapons into Ukraine, right? They are going through 10 million artillery shells a year. Now, before the war, they could make 1 million new artillery shells a year. They've ramped that production up. Today, they can make 2 million artillery shells a year, but it's still far less than what they're firing, right? And so that has pushed Russia onto the world market, looking for a place where it can get more weapons. And if you're in the market for artillery shells, you end up on the Korean Peninsula. And for Russia, that means talking to North Korea.
In modern weaponry, shells have much tighter tolerances than when they were fighting the Battle of Waterloo, let's say. They have to be machined to a very high specification. Does North Korea have a capable, reliable, homegrown weapons industry?
When it comes to artillery shells, the North Korean weapons are pretty good. If there was to be a war on the Korean Peninsula, it would be an artillery battle, at least in its opening salvos, right? There are thousands of artillery tubes not far from Seoul in North Korea, aimed at the South Korean city. So they spend a lot of money building artillery guns and maintaining their artillery shells. And Russia is fighting our artillery war in Ukraine. Now, the issue is that Russia has a huge stockpile of shells, but they haven't done a very good job at maintaining them. The United States has exercises every year where they keep their pre-positioned weapon systems. It happens in Europe, it happens in Israel, it happens in South Korea. The American stocks of artillery shells are taken out and inspected and looked at, maintained, rotated. Russia doesn't have this same culture of maintaining ammunition. And as a result, their artillery shells have deteriorated. And from my understanding, the biggest problem is the Russian fuses. Now, the artillery shells have a fuse, so they explode not when they hit the ground in that kind of Waterloo style that you alluded to, but they burst. And if you have defenders, they air burst. So if you have defenders who are hiding in trenches and the artillery shell explodes on impact with the ground, it's less deadly than it would explode in the air. A lot of these Russian shells have been exploding when they hit the ground. Russia wants to get some shells that explode in the air. That'll be more deadly for Ukrainian troops. That's one big reason the United States would like to stop this sale.
Like any deal of its kind, this is a two-way street. What does North Korea need that Russia can supply? Is this mutually beneficial?
North Korea has been developing its missile program for quite some time. This is how North Korea threatens Japan. This is how North Korea threatens the United States. This is how North Korea gets the attention of Washington. And the North Korean record on their missile production has been mixed, right? Sometimes they have successful launches. They've developed an intercontinental ballistic missile that can, in theory, hit Hawaii. But we also know that there's a lot of failed North Korean launches. These are not reliable weapons. They do not have the range or reliability of the Russian fleet of ballistic missiles. So Russian technology is something that North Korea very much wants, and it's something that Russia has been unwilling to give so far. But we see with this meeting a new willingness between Russia and North Korea to make a deal.
You know, when you talk about North Korea and Russia, somewhere along the way, you really have to talk about China. And China has much broader interests than North Korea worldwide. Customers for its consumer goods all over the world, investments and assets all around the world. And it's been hesitant to jump into the Ukraine war with materiel on Russia's side. Can Kim's North Korea kind of act as a proxy for China?
Well, you're exactly right. It's China's integration with the rest of the world's economy that makes it easier to deter. And so when the United States has learned about possibilities of arms deals between China and Russia, they have yelled very loudly. They have released the intelligence. And that seems to have worked. It's not that China hasn't given anything to Russia. There is definitely a flow of so-called dual-use components from China to Russia. And that's been very important for Russia as it rebuilds its defense industry after Western sanctions. But they have been unwilling to give drones, missiles, artillery shells directly. And that's partially why North Korea is stepping in here. Now, as you also alluded to, North Korea has one real friend or protector, and that's China, right? It would be very surprising if North Korea was doing this against the wishes of China. Now, China may not have said anything explicitly, but North Korea knows what they can get away with in that front. So if we see a big arms deal, it at least has some degree of blessing by Beijing.
So China can kind of keep its hands clean, in effect, turn North Korea into the third-party country on this deal and not directly give Russia some of the things it's looking for?
That's right. I would be very surprised, given the current state, if we see any direct supply of sophisticated weaponry from China to Russia. And I would be surprised even if we saw artillery shells go there. But China very much wants to help Russia the way it can. It's been buying Russian oil. It's been continuing its trade with Russia. So it's not like China is a neutral party in this. They may not want this war to go on forever. They are definitely trying to play some kind of element of a peacekeeping or a peacemaker role here. But they're on Russia's side. We remember well, like that meeting between Xi and Putin before the Ukraine war began, where they pledged a partnership without limits. Now, there clearly are limits to that partnership, but it is a partnership. And it is in the interest of both countries. And so we see the hand of China here, even when they're not explicitly involved.
One thing that makes understanding this story so difficult is Russia's opacity. It's not like you can just read their annual reports and find out exactly what they're capable of making, capable of selling. You can't believe figures that come out of the central bank. It's complicated. One thing that is interesting to watch is this tremendous gush of information that purportedly comes out of Russia. At one end of the continuum, you've got a country that's almost incapable of making the things it needs and relying on others and selling natural resources in order to get things from the rest of the world that it can't make for itself. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got reporting that says, no, Russia's got the situation in hand. They are able to make plenty, but right now they're in the midst of shuttling a lot more of their resources than they're used to into military rather than civilian goods. Where do you come down on that continuum between those two poles? Can Russia, like a front-rank power, like a modern industrial state, supply most of its needs for attacking Ukraine?
We looked as part of our reporting as closely as we could to sort of Russian production. And what we found was immediately after the beginning of the war, for about 6 months, 9 months, Russian production fell off. They suddenly did not have access to the Western markets that they had used for decades to build things for their military base. I mean, something as simple as ball bearings slowed down tank production. But it turned out that that was only a temporary effect. It's pretty easy to find a ball bearing even if you can't make it. Now, maybe you don't get the best German ball bearings that you used to get, but you can find ball bearings elsewhere on the world market. And so today, if we look at Russian production, not just for artillery shells, but also for sort of more sophisticated precision-guided missiles, they're able to make more today than they were at the start of the war. The production went way off and now is building up. But when you talk to American officials, they say, look, there is a real cost to that. Like when you see all these problems in the Russian economy, these rising interest rates, the sort of real problems that average everyday Russians are starting to feel, that is because boosting this military production doesn't come without cost. And so they have retooled their economy to put it on a war footing, but there have been problems for everyday Russians. And so the Western strategy is to continue to press on the sanctions and to see if they can get them to bite once more like they did at the beginning of the war and kind of curb some of this war production. Now, they're probably not going to succeed at cutting off the ball bearings. That's hard. But the focus is on some of these higher-end chips or medium-end silicon chips. There, they think that if they can cut off the flow from third countries like Armenia, Turkey, they can once more put a dent in Russian military production.
Those are great examples because, yes, the world is awash, not in the best ball bearings, but in ball bearings, and they are dual-use, so-called dual-use technologies. Many advanced weapon systems, as you allude to, and their support rely on microprocessors, and Russia's not very good at building those. China is better, but reluctant to supply. Has Russia's difficulties in buying microprocessors shown up on the battlefield yet? Are there things that they're using to fight in Ukraine that if they had their druthers would be much better made and much better equipped?
Well, that's a complex question, but we think we have an answer for you. And it is that if we rewind to last year and last December, there was kind of a break in Russian missile after an intense barrage in November of missiles. By the end of December, the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure were going down. And the reason some U.S. officials believe is that they ran out of chips at that time. The problem here is that Russian engineers are some of the world's best. And it turns out they could make a missile that was very good, not quite as good as a missile with a perfect chip, but with a very kind of run-of-the-mill circuit boards. So they took the kinds of circuit boards you use to put in a refrigerator and they put it in their precision cruise missile. You might not think that would work, but Russian engineers made it work. And that is part of the problem. The Ukrainians have been very clever at coaxing new efficiencies out of old weapons, and the Russians can do it too. And so that is the complex thing here. When we find a choke point, we try to block them from that component. But the Russians are not going to just sit still. They're going to react, and they're going to try to find a way around it. So it's going to be a continuing cat and mouse game on the world's markets.
That situation you just described, for me, it kind of encapsulates Russia's modern experience. It's a country that's both a poor country and a rich country at the same time. So resource rich, the average Russian should be rich, but it has been almost uniquely unsuccessful in turning its human capital into wealth for the country. And, here you are talking about the wealth they have in trained engineers, people who can hack low-tech equipment and make it work better. You kind of wish that we lived in a world where they could have made Russians richer because they'd be less likely to be attacking Ukraine.
It's a great tragedy, right? Because it is exactly as you said. It is a country of great natural resources. It's a country that has a world-class education system, especially with engineering, but also with culture and the arts. And it ought to be a leading country on the world stage in a positive way. But yet the authoritarianism that gripped the country has created this huge income inequality where you have these oligarchs with incomprehensible amounts of wealth. And then you have a country that's kept relatively destitute despite the educational wealth, despite the natural resources wealth. It's a tragedy for the world. And to your point, it has an impact on what's going on now, because if you want to distract your population from the underlying problems, starting a war is one way to do it.
Russia has worked hard as an outgrowth of that authoritarianism that you mentioned. Russia's worked hard to keep its own people less than fully briefed on the fighting in Ukraine, let's say. And it's spent heavily at the same time to support the supply of both guns and butter. But is there a limit? Can the Russian economy keep it up, diverting money into military spending while supporting the ruble, while telling the people that this is a war that must be fought? Is that charade starting to wear thin for the average Russian? Can they see that there's a difference between the glory that they're seeing on TV and hearing about in their media and what's really happening in places like Bakhmut and Mariupol?
It's a really good question. It's one that the U.S. policymakers, U.S. intelligence officials wrestle with quite a lot. What is public opinion in Russia? When will the truth start getting through? And what will it take? We had this moment during the rebellion by Yevgeny Prigozhin, where all of a sudden the Russian state looked weak for a moment, right? And there is some indication that that penetrated more widely in the country. People started talking about that. People started sort of processing this. Now, it has not, from what we can tell from imperfect measures of Russian public opinion, broken support for the war. But there are real questions about the military leadership that Mr. Prigozhin's rebellion brought to the fore, and that his comments beforehand criticizing Russian military leaders brought to the fore. There are two things that could break the support that Putin still has. One would be an economic downturn. If these interest rates go higher and higher, and if the economy is out of step with the rest of Europe, out of step with Asia, that could begin to bite. But also, if Putin is forced to do a broader draft, a broader mobilization of the military, he's kind of avoided doing a full mobilization, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because even his partial mobilizations have led to a huge brain drain, a huge flight of educated people, especially educated young men from the country. So that is a long-winded way of saying we don't know, but these are the indicators that we look at. A draft, the economy, casualties, and how is that impacting the thinking of average Russians?
Now that we're a year and a half into this thing, do you feel satisfied that U.S. Western estimates of Russian losses, both in men and materiel, or that they have good sources, that they're roughly on point? Have you had a chance over this long haul to see borne out the kinds of things you're getting from British intelligence, from American intelligence?
I think it is an important caveat to say we are not sure of the accuracy of that. Russia is trying to hide their casualties. Ukraine, for that matter, is also trying to hide their casualties from the West. Neither country is reporting. Russia especially is doing things to hide the war dead, delay when bodies are returned home, try to make it so that there's not mass levels of funerals in one town. They are not honest about the casualties they are incurring. And the U.S. estimates are just estimates, right? They are listening to secret reports the Russians send up their chain of command. They are counting the number of vehicles blown up by Ukrainians from satellite imagery and are trying to make estimates. So it's important to remember it is just an estimate, right? But the fact of the matter is these are high casualties. Both sides are taking high casualties. Both sides have a manpower problem. Ukraine is going to need to bring more people into its military. Russia is going to face a time later this year when they're going to have to do another mobilization. And we are going to learn a lot about how Vladimir Putin views his hold on power. If he does a partial mobilization, just brings in a few people, then he may be thinking his place is more precarious. If he does a very broad draft, he may be feeling stronger after overcoming the Prigozhin challenge and may feel like there's no one who can challenge him. So these next few months will be very important on that question.
One of the most interesting commodities whipping around the world, certainly if you're Russian and trying to keep money flowing into the national treasury, is oil. And the West has put a cap on the price per barrel. And Russia's close friends in Beijing haven't said, oh, no, we don't pay attention to that cap. We're just going to pay what we think you ought to get and shuttle money to them. They've driven a very hard bargain. So have fence sitters in India who have benefited from this cap. Is Russia being trapped into the unenviable position of having to pump oil at a heightened pace, even though it's being forced to sell it at a discount? Do they have to keep the spigot open, even though some of their big new customers are observing the cap?
Yeah, the cap has worked a little bit better than some people thought. Some people thought that India and China would ignore the cap and just pay slightly below market rates for Russian oil. But the cap is limiting Russia's money. And this is part of the reason why the economy is not doing well. There were a lot of naysayers in journalism, in other governments about the cap, but it seems to have put some pressure. And this is one reason why, although short-term, the economic pain is sort of limited, they believe the Western officials, U.S. officials, British officials, believe over time they can exert a level of pain on the Russian economy that could force Putin to make some different decisions. So listen, Russia has a lot of energy resources. At the beginning of that war, it was giving them a huge advantage. It's still an advantage. They're still making money, but it's less now because they have effectively put limits on Russian sales.
And what about the Black Sea? The Russians have backed out of the deal that allowed Ukrainian grain to flow out of the Black Sea, through the Bosporus, and out to the Mediterranean. They think they may be cutting off Ukrainian access to funds, but they also are not doing themselves any favors either, are they?
There was a report that was declassified from the intelligence community in August. It was a report from back in June, from just before Russia left the deal, that warned about hunger problems worldwide should Russia back out. And of course they did. This is going to be felt acutely in places like Egypt and North Africa, places that really rely on grain and food from Ukraine. The ending of this deal could have real consequences in Africa and other places that have been important for places in the global south that have at least not condemned Vladimir Putin, even if they haven't outright supported him. There is some hope that Africa can step up and exert some pressure on Russia to resume this. It is a real problem for the world, and not just a problem for Ukraine, but a problem for the world if grain, corn, and other agricultural products cannot come out of the Black Sea.
Julian Barnes is a veteran national security reporter working for the New York Times, covering intelligence agencies and military intelligence. Great to have you with us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Andrew Stelzer and fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.